You remember how the events played out as Kabul fell and Afghanistan was taken back by the Taliban, and all that effort to recapture Afghanistan, to save women's education, to sort out the mess, and to find Osama bin Laden, and to suppress the Taliban. All of that was pointless. All the British Army's efforts to engage with the local community, all a waste of time, because Dominic Raab was sunning himself on the beach in Crete because Trump had made a decision to withdraw the American troops and because Biden carried it out like a poodle. What can we say? What we can say is that we had a duty then to respond positively to those Afghans who had put their lives in danger for our, what should we call it, expedition, adventure, our episode, our James Bond moment, when we tried to look as if we were involved in the big game, the great game. Russia didn't get it right. Maybe we could. No, we couldn't, because in the end Dominic Raab was sunning himself and sapping on factor 10 on a beach in Crete. Couldn't be bothered. Now, the BBC published a number of reports about the Triples. These are the Afghan commandos who we trained to work alongside the special forces, particularly the SAS, and to help in our mission, to take out the Taliban, the various forces that we had defined as terrorist, who were supporting Osama bin Laden. Now, all of this may be complete hokum. What is true, of course, is that girls in Afghanistan now are now denied an education, and they had it for a short period of time while the Western forces were in control. We gave up. We abandoned. So many people, so many soldiers, British soldiers, lost their lives for what? For an adventure. For nothing more than an adventure which we abandoned. It's now back to what it was originally, if not worse. And the BBC reported that a lot of the Triples who applied for resettlement or asylum, let's use the correct word, who applied for asylum in the UK were denied that option. Now, they speculated in February this year that one of the reasons for this was that there was an investigation being carried out by Lord Justice Haddon Cave to see whether there was any truth in the allegations that some special forces had been involved in war crimes. Of course, if these Afghan commando units were so closely aligned and so carefully working with the British special services, then they would know. And the BBC put out a report saying that the special services had been given the option to veto individual applications. So these commandos were left abandoned in Afghanistan, like many of the translators were left abandoned in Afghanistan. Now, following this BBC report, a Labour MP, Luke Pollard, the Shadow Arms Minister, wrote to the Defence Ministry, sent a written question in Parliament asking whether the SAS had a veto over the application for resettlement by Afghan refugees. And the government replied, no such veto exists, no such mechanism exists for any government or government body. That's quite clear. The BBC, in other words, was misguided, the BBC had reported badly, and the BBC was wrong. But it wasn't just one person who received a letter exonerating the SAS and ridiculing the BBC efforts. a second MP, an SNP parliamentarian, Stuart MacDonald, wrote a similar letter and again received a letter back from the Ministry of Defence saying that no veto was possible for the application. So the BBC report in February was soundly declared to be wrong, with 2 written answers from a government ministry. And now, in the height of the election campaign, when attention is elsewhere, a government minister, a defence minister, Andrew Morrison, has written to Stuart MacDonald to say that there was an error in his initial response. And now he says that that SAS assessments had in fact taken a part in the process used by caseworkers in resettlement or asylum requests by members of the Afghan commando units. So, you've got to remember, hundreds of resettlement requests were rejected in 2021, and now this desultory minister admits that the veto, as described by the BBC, played a role in that rejection. In addition, the qualification by Andrew Morrison, this defence minister, was sneaked out during an election campaign and sent, apparently, according to the SNP Member of Parliament, it was sent out to a generic email address rather than his own email address, in the hope, says Stuart MacDonald, that it would go under the radar and wouldn't be noticed until it was too late. In other words, it was an act of self-righteous, arrogant deceit. It's pitiable, it's contemptuous, it's contemptible. It's a desecration of our duty to those people who put their lives at risk for us, but it's also a distortion of the honour that our country holds dear. It's utterly, utterly shocking. And this level of deceit just spins on and on and on. And the Ministry of Defence has now said to, the BBC wrote to the Ministry of Defence, or spoke to the Ministry of Defence to say, what do you have to say about that? And they have answered the BBC and said that there's no evidence to suggest the Ministry of Defence had interfered with the resettlement process. Well, look at that wording. There's no evidence to suggest, is what they wrote. That's not a denial. That's saying that we hope nobody's going to find a smoking gun, that you can't find the evidence. All you can find is the tittle-tattle and the confessions. You're not going to find the evidence. So it's not quite a denial. What a conniving, spiteful, nasty organisation this is turning out to be. Why would anybody trust the Ministry of Defence? Why would anybody trust Britain, again, to put their trust in us to be honourable because they've been brought up on traditions of Kipling and Conan Doyle? Why would anybody think that we can possibly keep our word? Because ultimately we are revealed to be utter contemptible shits. Now, the SNP man has sent on the information to Lord Justice Haddon Cave in the hope that it will now take a part in the inquiry which is ongoing. But this is one more action, a sort of postscript, perhaps, literally, to the fallout from a lazy, dilatory, contemptuous and arrogant government, and sparked off by the actions of a lazy, contemptuous, arrogant minister, foreign minister, Dominic Raab, lazing around on the sands of Crete rather than getting on with the job that he is appointed to do in our name. He was unable to do the right thing then, or put it right later. And there have been offers of a review of these Afghan commandos who've been abandoned, who are hiding. Many of them are in hiding, even now in Afghanistan, because of what they did to support the British and the American effort there. I mean, I hope you agree with me. This is so utterly horrific. And the way that it's revealed is so utterly horrific. It needs to be called out. It needs to be, I mean, you know, at this moment now, somebody needs to raise this issue with Rishi Sunak, finally, when he starts answering questions from the audience in question time. But I doubt anybody will have that option. This is the tyranny of deceit. And it's like a disease, and it seems to infect every part of our society at the moment. And it needs to be uprooted, and we need to have a reboot and a rebrand, and I think that needs to involve an alliance, a stronger alliance. David Lammy is already talking, by the way, about a contract or an international agreement between Britain and the EU, which is absolutely essential. It may not be part of our reintegration with the EU, but we need a mechanism for restarting that cooperation as grown-ups, because the children need to be soundly removed from the room and from this debate. The children, whether they are lording it over their fellows in the army, or whether they are doing the same thing in a ministry, or whether they're doing it in government. And Jeremy Hunt, by the way, I get into trouble for saying that I think our bureaucracy is out of control. Jeremy Hunt, who's about to lose his seat, of course, Jeremy Hunt talks about today, is revealed in a in a tape of a meeting that he had in the Oxford Union in May. He's revealed as saying that there's too many shoddy bureaucracies going on, that the bureaucratic system is out of control. Of course it is. And it's run by people who are playing double standards with language. I mean, you know, there's no evidence to suggest, oh, come on, wake up and start using real words with real meanings and stop playing these stupid games, because you all look like children. And I'm so disgusted with these people who think that they can play with language and who are sitting in authority over us, whether these people are bureaucrats or senior officials or even elected representatives in these ministries. They all need to grow up, because there is a disease which is passing through Whitehall, and that disease is called deceit. And I think it's going to take at least a generation to eradicate it, but the first step is to acknowledge it and to recognize what harm it is doing. And part of that disease, of course, is that it was led from the top, from people like Boris. But Boris was not the only liar. Theresa May, Liz Truss. Well, Liz Truss wasn't so much a liar, she was just deluded. But the deceit is somehow accepted at the moment. How can you word this in such a way that you can avoid responsibility? This is what led to Amber Rudd's resignation, rather than Theresa May accepting responsibility for the mess of the Windrush paperwork. It's just wrong. Just wrong. Please do leave your comments. I'd be really interested to know what you've got to say about this, and if you share my sense of horror, really. Horror, frustration, and determination. This must change. And what? How do you think this can change? Because it must.